The last photograph anyone took of Lynette Hooker shows her standing beside a pool in the Bahamas sun. She is smiling. The L necklace is visible against her collarbone. The Apple Watch is on her wrist. She looks like a woman on vacation, relaxed and unhurried. The kind of smile that belongs to someone who has no idea that anything is about to change. That photograph was taken at the Abaco Inn on the evening of April 4th. Within hours of that image being captured, Lynette Hooker would be gone, and the man standing closest to her in that final window of her life would spend the next 5 weeks telling a story that federal investigators now appear to believe is a lie from beginning to end. The boat he called home is wrapped in crime scene tape. His name is Brian Hooker, and the evidence that has been building since Easter Sunday is closing around him the way water closes around something dropped into the deep. This is the Crime Files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the pursuit of truth. Lynette Hooker was in her late 50s. She had spent the last 4 years living aboard a 46-foot sailing sloop named Soulmate, alongside her husband, Brian Hooker. The live-aboard life is not for everyone. It requires adaptation, patience, and a willingness to trade the stability of a fixed address for something harder to define and harder to give up once you have tasted it. Lynette had made that trade. She had a daughter named Carly Ellsworth, 28 years old, who Brian had helped raise since Carly was approximately 3. She had a mother named Darlene Hamlet, who describes her in the language of someone who measured time in the brightness her daughter brought to ordinary days. She had a father, a brother, friends who lit up when they heard her name. She was not a peripheral figure in other people's stories. She was the center of her own. The Abacos region of the Bahamas is a chain of islands and cays stretched along the northeastern edge of the archipelago. Marsh Harbor is the largest settlement in the Abacos, a working harbor town with a marina, restaurants, a small commercial district, and the kind of international boating traffic that comes with being one of the most popular cruising destinations in the Atlantic. Lubbers Quarters. Cay sits across the channel from Marsh Harbor, smaller and quieter, home to the Abaco Inn, a waterfront establishment with a bar, a pool, and surveillance cameras that would later become central to the investigative timeline. Brian and Lynette Hooker were anchored in that general area of the Abacos in the days before April 4th. They were known to the local boating community in the way that long-term cruisers become known. Familiar faces on the water, regulars in the anchorage. According to the account Brian Hooker provided to Bahamian police, to family members, and to 3 major American television networks in the days after the incident, the events of the evening of April 4th unfolded as follows. He and Lynette had been drinking throughout the day. That detail came from Brian himself in a direct conversation with Darlene Hamlet. At some point in the evening, they were traveling by dinghy, the small inflatable tender used to move between their anchored sailboat and shore. Something happened on the water. Brian's account describes Lynette going overboard from the back of the dinghy. He said the seas were rough. He said he threw something flotational toward her. He said he lost sight of her. He said the dinghy drifted, and he was unable to control it or return to Soulmate. He said he spent the night adrift in the darkness before washing up on the eastern shore of Marsh Harbor, approximately 4 miles from the location of the alleged incident, at around 4 in the morning on Easter Sunday, April 5th. He said he fired flares. He said he knocked on doors. He said he stopped a car on a road and told the driver his wife was missing. He said the driver closed the door and left. He said he bushwhacked through rough brush, the ground sharp on his feet, until he reached the Marsh Harbor Marina. A guard at the marina initiated the emergency call that launched the search and rescue operation. That is the story. Written out plainly, it is a story that asks a great deal of the listener. It asks you to believe in a specific sequence of failures, each one compounding the last, that resulted in a woman dying in the water while her husband of decades drifted helplessly through the night. People survive terrible accidents. People are overwhelmed by sudden catastrophe. Stories of maritime tragedy are real and documented and heartbreaking. But a story also has to hold its own weight against the physical evidence, the behavioral record, and the testimony of people who knew the individuals involved. Brian Hooker's story does not hold that weight, not even close. 8 in the evening. Lynette Hooker is last confirmed alive by witness accounts and surveillance footage at the Abaco Inn property. 9:13 in the evening. Phone records associated with the investigation reflect a timestamp that investigators have noted in reviewing the communications record. 11:42 in the evening. The approximate window Brian Hooker places the incident, with the dinghy roughly 1,000 yards from Soulmate's anchor position. 4 in the morning. Brian's stated arrival time on the eastern shore of Marsh Harbor. 6 in the morning, approximately. Marsh Harbor Marina Security contacts emergency services and the formal search operation begins. That is a span of 10 hours between the last confirmed sighting of Lynette and the moment help was summoned. 10 hours during which, according to Brian Hooker, a woman was in the water and a man was drifting in a dinghy and no effective alert was raised. In 10 hours of darkness in a busy cruising anchorage during an Easter holiday weekend, a man with maritime experience, a functioning flare gun with 2 rounds, and a dinghy that apparently remained intact enough to carry him 4 miles could not get help. That is what his story requires you to accept. The flare detail is one of the most specific and damaging contradictions in the public record of this case. Brian Hooker told Lynette's mother Darlene in direct conversation that he had fired 2 flares from the dinghy. 2. He said that was everything he had. He said he fired both of them trying to flag down passing vessels. He described boats moving through the darkness that ignored his signals. He described the Easter holiday reducing boat traffic to the point where help was unavailable. But information that later reached the family, relayed by Darlene in her interview, revealed that when the dinghy was recovered and examined, the flare gun still contained an unfired round. 1 flare had been fired. 1 remained in the chamber. Brian Hooker told Darlene he fired 2. The physical evidence of the weapon says 1. A man fighting for his life and his wife's life in dark open water does not stop at 1 flare when a second is within reach. The explanation for this discrepancy is either that Brian Hooker did not fire the second flare because the emergency he described was not actually occurring, or that his account of the flares is simply and deliberately false. When search and rescue personnel from Marsh Harbor Fire and Rescue arrived and mobilized their teams, they operated on the information Brian Hooker provided. He told them Lynette had been wearing a 2-piece black bathing suit. He did not mention the royal blue headscarf from Conch Republic that she had with her. He did not mention the aquamarine bathing suit cover-up. He did not mention the black fanny pack. He did not mention the color of the dry bag she was carrying. Search and rescue operations depend on precise physical descriptions. A brightly colored item of clothing or a distinctively colored dry bag floating in open water can be spotted from a distance that would make a person in dark water nearly invisible. By giving searchers an incomplete and imprecise description of what Lynette was wearing and carrying, Brian Hooker sent those teams into the water looking for the wrong thing. Whether that was a result of shock and cognitive failure in a genuine emergency or a deliberate withholding of information is a question investigators have not publicly answered. But the fire and rescue personnel involved in this case have made clear their frustration with what they were given. Brian Hooker asked a fire and rescue representative for the contact information of a boat rental service. He said he wanted to go out and join the search. He said he was committed to finding Lynette. He was given the information. He never called. The rental service was never contacted. The fire and rescue personnel followed up. They confirmed Brian Hooker had made no attempt to rent a boat or participate in the search he had publicly said he wanted to join. The footwear detail is small, but it stays with you. In his account to Darlene, Brian described the ground on the shore as sharp on his feet. He described the terrain as rough, the brush as dense, the physical ordeal of reaching the marina as significant. Sharp ground on bare feet, rough brush on exposed skin. The language of someone who endured real physical difficulty in the dark. When rescue personnel reached Brian Hooker at the Marsh Harbor Marina, he was wearing blue slides, sandals, the kind of casual footwear you slip on to walk 10 feet to the dock or grab something from below deck, not the footwear of a man who had spent hours in rough terrain with sharp coral rock cutting at his feet. The slides were on. The ground had apparently not been sharp enough to remove them. Within 24 hours of the incident being reported, Brian Hooker gave arranged interviews to 3 major American television networks. These were not spontaneous statements captured by a reporter who happened to be nearby. They were coordinated media appearances in which Brian Hooker, with apparent deliberateness, presented his account to the largest possible audience. In those interviews, he said he would not leave the Bahamas. He said nothing could make him leave without Lynette. He said it would take a higher authority to separate him from his commitment to finding her. Those are strong words. Those are the words of someone who understands the importance of being seen as devoted and present. Approximately 24 hours after those interviews aired, Brian Hooker had obtained an emergency passport and was on a flight out of Nassau. He left the Bahamas. He left before Lynette was found. He left before the search produced any results. He left, and he went quiet. In the 5 weeks following his departure, Brian Hooker made no contact with Lynette's mother. He made no contact with Carly, the daughter he had helped raise since she was 3 years old. He did not reach out on Carly's 29th birthday. He did not acknowledge Mother's Day. He did not call Lynette's father. He did not call her brother. He retained an attorney in Michigan. He was reportedly seen briefly in Michigan, then said to be traveling to California to visit his sick mother and his sister. His location was not publicly confirmed. The family he shared with Lynette for decades simply stopped hearing from him entirely. In criminal law and in the investigative framework used by federal prosecutors, this pattern of behavior following a loss is sometimes described as consciousness of guilt. It is not itself a crime. It is not itself proof of anything, but it is a pattern, and patterns are what investigators are trained to recognize and document. On Mother's Day, the United States Coast Guard interdicted Soulmate offshore. The vessel was being delivered back to Florida by a hired captain and first mate, paid by Brian Hooker to bring the boat from the Bahamas to American waters. Those two individuals had no idea what was about to happen. Coast Guard vessels approached with sirens and lights. A boarding was announced. The delivery crew complied. Soulmate was towed into Fort Pierce Harbor and brought to the Coast Guard station there. Federal agents boarded the vessel and conducted a search that lasted more than 3 hours. They set up an evidence processing table on the dock. Items were removed from the vessel, placed into official evidence bags, photographed, and cataloged. The agents went below deck and spent significant time there. When they were done, they left crime scene tape around the entire vessel. Yellow tape, visible from the water, visible from the air. Soulmate was officially designated a crime scene. This designation is the most significant public development in the investigation to date, and its implications are direct. Brian Hooker's account places the critical events of April 4th approximately 1,000 yards from Soulmate. He said they never made it back to the boat. He said the incident happened on the dinghy, in the water, far from the vessel. If that were true, there would be no reason to surround Soulmate with crime scene tape. There would be no reason to spend 3 hours below deck pulling evidence. The boat would be irrelevant. Federal investigators do not designate irrelevant locations as crime scenes. They do not tape off boats and spend full working days processing them because of a hunch or a formality. They do it because they believe that location is where a crime occurred. The crime scene tape on Soulmate is, in the language available to investigators who have not yet filed charges, the closest thing to an official statement about what they believe happened on the night of April 4th. Among the items that may be of greatest forensic significance is the Apple Watch. Lynette wore it regularly. She was photographed wearing it at the Abaco Inn pool in the days immediately preceding her disappearance. Her daughter Carly told investigators and journalists that Lynette had a habit of removing the watch in the evening hours, around dinner time, because its battery life was limited and she wanted it on the charger before bed. If Lynette followed that habit on the evening of April 4th, and if she removed the watch and placed it on its charger aboard Soulmate before leaving for the Abaco Inn that evening, the watch would have been aboard the vessel throughout the window in which everything that matters allegedly occurred. An Apple Watch connected to its charger and paired to a nearby phone generates data, movement data, heart rate intervals, timestamps, location anchors. If the watch was recovered from Soulmate during the federal search, and if its iCloud backup was preserved and subpoenaed, investigators may have access to a minute-by-minute record of everything the watch registered during the critical window of April 4th and 5th. That kind of data, in a case where the only account of events comes from a single person whose credibility is in serious question, would be extraordinarily valuable. Lynette's L necklace was found aboard Soulmate. Her wedding ring was found aboard Soulmate. Carly Ellsworth, who traveled to the Bahamas in the days after her mother's disappearance, reported that both items were on the boat. Lynette wore that necklace consistently. Outside of her Apple Watch, the L necklace was described by Carly as the one piece of jewelry her mother wore every day. Finding it on the boat rather than on Lynette's person is a detail that does not fit cleanly into the narrative Brian Hooker constructed. In his account, Lynette went into the water from a dinghy, somewhere out in the channel, far from Soulmate. Her necklace and her wedding ring were on the boat. How those items came to be there if Lynette never returned to Soulmate that night is a question that has not been answered. The surveillance footage from the Abaco Inn is a thread that investigators have been pulling since the early days of this case. There are cameras at the bar. There are cameras at the pool. There is a camera positioned to cover the dock area where the dinghy would have been tied up during the evening. The Royal Bahamas Police Force reviewed that footage. One witness who spoke to journalists stated that they were shown surveillance video by Bahamian investigators and identified Brian and Lynette in the footage, describing Brian's shirt as tan or gray with no pattern. The bartender who served Brian that evening recalled him wearing a blue and white shirt. Whether those two descriptions correspond to different shirts worn at different points in the evening or reflect something more significant has not been resolved publicly. What is known is that the footage exists. has been reviewed by investigators and contains images of Brian and Lynette together during the final hours before she disappeared. The geolocation data generated by modern smartphones is the kind of evidence that exists whether or not the people it documents thought about it at the time. Every phone connected to a cellular network generates records of which towers it connects to and when. Every phone with location services enabled generates GPS coordinates at regular intervals. Most of those coordinates are backed up automatically to cloud servers that the individual user cannot access or delete. Federal investigators with appropriate warrants can subpoena that data from carriers and from technology companies. The location history of Brian Hooker's phone and of Lynette Hooker's phone during the evening of April 4th and into the early morning hours of April 5th would tell a story. It would show where those phones were. It would show whether either phone was near Soulmate during the window. Brian says they were both far from it. If that data exists and has been preserved, it is among the most potentially decisive evidence in this case. Brian Hooker answered 4 out of approximately 94 questions posed to him by Bahamian police during his formal interview. That figure, reported by Darlene Hamlet, represents a level of legal caution that is essentially incompatible with the posture of an innocent person desperate to help investigators find his missing wife. An innocent man who has just survived a terrible maritime accident and lost his wife in the water does not decline to answer 90 of 94 questions. He answers everything. He draws maps. He names every vessel he saw. He describes every moment of that night with the exhausted precision of someone who has been replaying it in his head since it happened. The decision to answer 4 questions and no more is the decision of someone who has been advised by counsel and who understands that anything he says can be used against him. It is the decision of someone who already knows, at the moment of that interview, that his story cannot withstand detailed scrutiny. Darlene Hamlet has been in this for 6 weeks. She does not sleep well. She wakes in the night and lies still and thinks. She has started counseling because she cannot make sense, on her own, of how someone does this. She and Carly have been spending time together. They went to dinner on Carly's birthday. They text almost every day. They cry, and then they remember things. And the remembering is its own kind of grief, because the memories are real, and the person they belong to is gone, and the man who was supposed to take care of her has not called once. Darlene says she has nothing to say to Brian Hooker. She says he knows how she feels. She says she is disappointed. She says he was given one job, to take care of her daughter, and he did not do it. She says it quietly, with controlled grief, the kind that has been compressed by weeks of waiting into something that fits in a single sentence, because there are not enough sentences in any language for what she actually means. A memorial is being discussed. Lynette had a footprint in Grand Rapids. She had roots in the Irish Hills, in Onstead. The people who are trying to honor her are working out how to gather across that geography into a single moment of shared recognition that she existed and mattered and is missed. That gathering is waiting. It is waiting because Lynette has not been found. And finding her is the first thing. Darlene says so plainly. Find her first. The evidence will handle the rest. The federal investigation continues. Soulmate sits impounded in Fort Pierce, its interior already searched, its evidence already cataloged, the crime scene tape still in place. Brian Hooker has not been charged. He is a free man. He is legally presumed innocent until a court determines otherwise. But the apparatus of federal justice does not surround boats with crime scene tape for the sake of appearances. It does not send agents below deck for 3 hours to retrieve nothing significant. It does not interdict vessels offshore and tow them into Coast Guard stations without having built a sufficient legal foundation to justify that action. The search warrant that authorized the boarding and search of Soulmate was signed by a judge who reviewed the basis for that warrant and found it sufficient. That is not nothing. That is the system working exactly as it is designed to work, methodically, carefully, with the weight of evidence behind every official action. The tip lines remain open. The Coast Guard Investigative Service has confirmed that information from the public has been useful. Anyone who was in Marsh Harbor on Easter Sunday morning, anyone who encountered a man on the road near the eastern shore claiming his wife was missing, anyone who has any information about the movements of Brian or Lynette Hooker on the night of April 4th is urged to come forward. The anonymous submission option through the Coast Guard app means that coming forward does not require putting your name on anything. It requires only that you share what you know. The water around the Abacos has not given up what it may be holding. The search for Lynette continues even as the investigation into what happened to her moves forward through other means. She is out there somewhere. Her family believes it. The investigators have not stopped looking, and the people who follow this case, the hundreds of thousands who have been watching and listening and sending tips and reaching out to Darlene and Carly with messages of support, they have not stopped caring either. That collective attention is not nothing. That is a community refusing to let a woman be erased from the record by silence and a convenient story about rough water and a dinghy and an Easter weekend with nobody around to help. There was somebody around. There is always somebody around. The Bahamas are not empty. The channel between Lubbers Quarters and Marsh Harbor is not deserted. The Easter holiday brings more boats to the Abacos, not fewer. People anchor there for the weekend specifically because it is beautiful and active and alive with maritime traffic. The story of a man adrift all night without being able to flag down a single vessel in one of the most popular cruising anchorages in the Atlantic on a holiday weekend is a story that does not match the geography and the culture and the community of the place where it is supposed to have occurred. The people who live there, who sail those waters, who run those bars and marinas and know those quays by feel, they have been saying so since the beginning. That is not how it works here. That is not what would have happened. And investigators are listening. Lynette Hooker wore an L necklace. She wore an Apple Watch. She smiled in a photograph by a pool on the last evening of her life. She had a mother who cannot sleep, and a daughter who spent her birthday without her, and a family that is holding together through something that should not have happened. She was real. She is real. And the truth about what happened to her is in the evidence, in the data, in the forensic record of a boat that is now a crime scene, in the digital trail that no amount of planning or silence can fully erase. The search for truth continues, and it will not stop until the answers are found. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, and a case that still has answers waiting to be uncovered. The search for truth continues. There is something that investigators and experienced maritime attorneys understand about crimes committed on the water that the general public often does not. The ocean is not a perfect crime scene. Saltwater degrades biological evidence. Currents move things. Time works against the forensic record in ways that a closed room or a controlled indoor environment does not. A person who commits a crime aboard a vessel and disposes of evidence in open water is betting on those natural processes working in their favor. They are betting on degradation, on drift, on the simple enormity of the ocean to swallow what needs to be hidden. That bet sometimes pays off, but it does not always pay off. And it pays off far less often than it once did, because the tools investigators bring to maritime crime scenes today are not the tools of 20 years ago. Luminol testing can detect the presence of blood on surfaces that have been cleaned, even surfaces that have been exposed to salt water and scrubbed. Touch DNA, the microscopic transfer of genetic material that occurs when a person makes contact with a surface, can be recovered from areas that appear visually clean. Trace evidence analysis can identify fibers, hair, and biological materials at quantities invisible to the naked eye. The interior of a vessel like Soulmate, with its confined spaces, its cushioned surfaces, its woodwork, its storage areas, its bilge, its head, its berths, is not a simple environment to sanitize. Every surface that two people lived among for 4 years contains a forensic record of their presence. Separating what belongs to the ordinary record of life aboard from what belongs to a specific event on a specific night is exactly what forensic analysts are trained to do. The 3 hours that agents spent below deck on Soulmate were not 3 hours of casual looking around. They were 3 hours of systematic, methodical, trained examination of every surface and space in that vessel. Whether those 3 hours produced the specific evidence needed to support a criminal charge is not yet publicly known. What is known is that agents left with evidence bags, multiple bags, photographed, cataloged, and transported under chain of custody protocols that ensure their contents will be admissible in court if charges are ultimately filed. The chain of custody is not a bureaucratic formality. It is the mechanism by which evidence moves from the crime scene to the courtroom without any legitimate challenge to its integrity. Federal agents are trained to maintain that chain from the moment they touch an item to the moment it is presented to a jury. Everything that came off Soulmate in those evidence bags is being handled with the understanding that it may one day be displayed to 12 people in a federal courtroom who will decide what it means. The sister's role in this case has been noted by investigators and journalists alike. Brian Hooker's sister flew to the Bahamas in the days immediately following Lynette's disappearance. She was present at the Abaco Inn in Marsh Harbor. She and Brian were observed sitting on the porch of that establishment for 2 days. Neither of them, during those 2 days, was observed participating in any active search for Lynette. They were present in the location, but not engaged in the effort. The sister may also have been involved in securing legal representation for Brian in Nassau during the period when he was briefly detained by Bahamian authorities. None of this is illegal. A person is entitled to call their family when they are in trouble. A person is entitled to have family members help arrange legal counsel. But the speed and efficiency with which those arrangements were made, the presence of the sister within days of the incident, the observation that she was at Brian's side rather than out on the water looking for Lynette, all of it adds texture to a picture of a man whose first instinct after Lynette's disappearance was not to find her, but to manage the situation. The boating community in the Abacos and the broader Caribbean sailing world is not a passive audience to this case. Experienced cruisers, captains, sailors who have spent decades on these waters have been vocal about the aspects of Brian Hooker's account that do not make sense to people who know how boats and bodies of water actually work. The claim that a man with 4 years of full-time live-aboard experience, navigating familiar anchorage waters in a functional dinghy, could not make it back to his own boat anchored less than 1,000 yards away, or could not effectively signal for help during a 10-hour period in a busy cruising anchorage on a holiday weekend, has been met with skepticism by people who understand what that environment actually looks like and how maritime emergency protocols actually function. The idea that not a single vessel in that anchorage on Easter weekend passed close enough to assist a man with a working flare and a functioning voice has been questioned by every captain and first mate who has spent time in the Abacos. That community is watching, and they are not satisfied with the story they have been given. The Royal Bahamas Police Force has retained the dinghy. That decision, which initially seemed unusual even to people close to the case, now reads as deliberate. The dinghy is physical evidence. Whatever it contains, whatever its interior surfaces may reveal about what actually happened that night, whatever trace evidence may have survived exposure to salt water and time, the Bahamian authorities have chosen to keep it rather than release it. Whether it has been formally examined, whether samples have been taken and sent for analysis, whether its contents have been inventoried and documented, is not publicly known. But the decision to hold it rather than release it suggests that investigators in the Bahamas, working in coordination with American federal authorities, believe the dinghy may still have something to tell them. Brian Hooker's decision to send Soulmate back to Florida on a hired delivery crew rather than sailing it himself is worth examining. Live-aboards who have been separated from their vessels for any period of time generally want to return to them personally. The boat is home. It is familiar. It contains everything you own and everything you live with. Hiring strangers to deliver your home across open water while you remain on shore is not a typical decision for someone in that community, particularly someone who has just experienced what Brian Hooker claims to have experienced. Grief-stricken, traumatized, disoriented. A man in that state would presumably want to be near the things that connect him to his life and to his missing wife. Instead, Brian Hooker hired a captain and first mate to bring the boat back without him. He arranged for a delivery he never completed. And those two hired sailors were the ones who found themselves facing a Coast Guard interdiction on open water, their routine delivery run transformed in an instant into a federal maritime law enforcement action that they had no part in creating. The Apple Watch deserves a final dedicated examination because of what it represents in terms of the technology of evidence. Modern smartwatches are not passive accessories. They are continuous data collection devices. They measure heart rate at regular intervals throughout the day and night. They track movement, steps, elevation changes, swimming activity, and a range of biometric signals that their wearers often do not think about as data being recorded. They generate location information when connected to a paired phone. They log when they are removed from the wrist and when they are put back on. They record when they are connected to their charger and when the battery is depleted. All of this data is time-stamped and, in most cases, automatically backed up to cloud servers associated with the account the device is registered to. That backup happens silently, in the background, without the user taking any deliberate action and without the user being able to prevent it, as long as the device is connected to a network. If Lynette Hooker placed her Apple Watch on its charger aboard Soulmate at any point on the evening of April 4th, that watch was generating data in the moments that mattered most. It would have recorded the time it was removed from her wrist. It would have recorded the time it was connected to the charger. It would have recorded any subsequent movement or interaction with the device during the night. If there was a moment when the watch detected something, a fall, a sudden absence of the biometric signal it was designed to track, a transition that does not fit the pattern of a person asleep in a bunk, that moment may be in the data. If that data was backed up before the watch lost connectivity, it is on a server somewhere. And if federal investigators obtained a warrant for that server data, they have access to it right now. The case of Lynette Hooker is not a case that exists only in the realm of speculation and allegation. It is a case with physical evidence, forensic analysis, phone records, surveillance footage, witness statements, behavioral documentation, and federal investigative resources being applied systematically to a specific set of questions about a specific set of events, on a specific night? The answers to those questions are either in the evidence already recovered or in evidence that investigators are still working to obtain. The public face of this investigation, the crime scene tape, and the evidence bags and the interdicted boat represents only what can be seen. What cannot be seen is the accumulating weight of forensic analysis, digital record review, and witness interview that forms the actual body of a federal case. That accumulation is happening. It is happening whether or not Brian Hooker is watching. It is happening whether or not anyone outside the investigation knows the specifics of what has been found. Lynette's mother is in Michigan. She goes to counseling. She wakes in the night and thinks. She has asked quietly and without drama for one thing above all others: find her daughter, bring Lynette home. Everything else, the accountability, the legal process, the verdict, if one ever comes, all of it waits behind that first and most essential need. A family does not get to grieve cleanly when the person they lost has not been found. They exist in a particular kind of suspension where the loss is real but the ending has not arrived, where the memorial is being planned but cannot yet be held, where the love and the grief and the fury at what may have been done all live together without resolution. That is where Darlene Hamlet is. That is where Carly Ellsworth is. That is where everyone who loved Lynette Hooker is right now, in the suspension, waiting for the water to give something back, waiting for the investigation to reach its conclusion, waiting for the moment when the uncertainty ends and something true and final can be said about what happened to Lynette on the night of April 4th in the waters off the Abacos. The crime scene tape is still on Soulmate. The evidence bags are in a federal facility. The case is open and moving forward. And somewhere in the Bahamas, in the water, or on a shoreline, or in a space that searchers have not yet reached, Lynette Hooker is waiting to be found. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, and a case that still has answers waiting to be uncovered. The search for truth continues.